So let's have a listen back to the sound with the Serum preset and all of the post-processing attached. Yo, Sketty here. Welcome back to my channel and a brand new tutorial. This time we're going to be looking at the fundamentals of how to make a Neurofunk bass in Serum and all of the post-processing that might go along with it as well. Before we get into the tutorial though, obviously it's YouTube, so do all the subscribing, like if you like the video, any comments of future tutorials that you'd like to see. I also live stream on Twitch during the week and on Sundays as well. All of the links and all that kind of stuff is going to be in the description. I'll also leave a preset to this Serum sound that we make in the description as well, so check that out. Right, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to look at, now don't mind the skin that I use, this is made by Thenerton, and I also added my Sketty logo as well. But we're going to reverse engineer this in a sense, because I've already made the sound, but I've just turned everything off in the effects tab and obviously the main tab as well. But this main LFO is going to be the thing that controls the majority of the sound. But before we really start sort of like looking at, okay, how do we get to the final sound, let's build it from the ground up. Now, one thing I do recommend with obviously any sort of bass sound is that you've got a consistent subnote. Now, in Serum, we have lots of different wave shapes that we can use, like from the most purest sine wave all the way through to a pulse width kind of sound, square waves and so on. Now, I like to use this, I call it an analog sine, but it's got more of a harmonic to it. And it just fills out the sort of mid-range a little bit more, and when we start to bring other effects like filtering and distortion, so on and so forth into it, that can get embellished a little bit more than just a pure sine wave. Now, one thing that I do is I pretty much tend to stay in octave -1, and if I go to this one as well, you can see it's octave -1. Now, a lot of producers will stay at 0, but the reason why I like to do that, if we just come out of Serum, I like to keep all of my bass in octave 1. So like if we look at Ableton here, we've got C1 to C2. Now if I kept that at 0, it means I have to bring this F1 down to F0 for it to be at the right pitch. So if I bring that up, we can see now that that sounds too high, so I'd have to bring it down to that note. So that's why I tend to -1 all of my octaves when it comes to the main fundamental of the sound. So that's pretty much the sub. I've kept the level the same. We're using the analog sine and the octave at -1. The next thing we're going to introduce is some bright white noise, and you can find that in analog, which is here. And I keep the level quite low. Now this is going to be used with the distortion, and this is something that you find in sort of Neurofunk kind of sounds, is that you have that raspy top end as the filter modulation starts to run through, and the one really quick way to do that is just to bring noise into your sound. And as you can hear when I just play those two notes together now, or those two sounds, the sub oscillator is obviously the loudest, and then we've got this in the background. And I pretty much just keep that where it is. Now we could use this LFO when we get to explain that and modulate that as well, but for this sound, not really necessary. Now obviously a lot of these techniques that I'm going to explain, these aren't just the gospel, this is how you make all Neurofunk basses, but this is just sort of getting into understanding how a Neurofunk Reese is made. And if you're one of those people, like for me for years was like, how do they make those sounds, then this is the kind of tutorial that's for you. One thing I always do before I get into anything else is I make my master level at 49% and make sure that my voicing is in mono, so only one note can be played once, because obviously we don't want to play chords with this. And the reason why I set my master to 49% is when we get to the compressor and stick it into multiband mode, it will stop it from ever clipping within the synth itself. So when you start to add post-processing effects, you're not just clipping the master channel straight away. Right, let's get into Oscillator A. Now, when it comes to waveforms, you can pretty much use anything you want. I would recommend, if you're just beginning and learning how to make Neurofunk basses, trying to stay away from anything that's got a massive amount of harmonics. Like for example, if we go to Spectral and just try one of these trilobites, as you can see, there's a lot of harmonic information there. which when you start to try and sort of distort and filter modulate this, you can be like, why does it sound so terrible? It's because of all of that information. When you throw that into a distortion unit, then it's going to just completely blow all of these frequencies out. So, oh, I've just forgotten which one I was using there. It is mini bass, there we go. So that's why I tend to stay with something, especially if you're just like new to making these sounds, stay with something that doesn't have that many harmonics. Now obviously this has got a few, but it's got none of the extreme high-end ones. Again, I obviously brought the octave down to -1, and this is what this sounds like. I've added Unison as well. Now I'm staying with 2 because what that does is it splits the waveform, one left and one right. So it's the same waveform, but one's going left and one's going right. If you have this as 3, then you have the original one in the center and then detuned one left and right. But with 2, you get this nice phasing, and you also start to get into almost Reese territory already. There's a slight bit of movement where obviously it changes the higher the pitch and the lower the pitch as well. So this is where that sort of like Neurofunk style basses can be classed as Reese as well because of that tiny amount of detune. Now with the blend and detune, obviously this is to taste. Like, I'm not just going to show you the specifics of, obviously we're going to go through this bass, but it's not just copy this bass, because you don't want to just sound like what I've made. It's to show you some of the techniques of where you can change things to your taste and your liking as well. And again, when it comes to Unison, change the blend and the detune to what you want it to be. There's no hard and fast rules. Obviously, if you detune too far, then it's going to get extreme. And then that might become a problem when it comes to obviously adding other effects and modulation to it, because this is obviously completely now out of tune with itself. Just hit my microphone there. So I tend to bring the detune down quite low. Just keeps that fundamental tone quite clean. Now obviously we can pan through the wavetable as well. I found that I liked it starting from here, but as you can see there's some modulation which we'll start to turn on in a bit as well. But as you sweep through, you can hear it's starting to introduce some really cool different tonalities, so that's why I've started to modulate with LFO1. We do have some FM from B, but that's obviously Oscillator B, which we'll get to in a second. Now this oscillator the level is turned all the way off because I didn't want to hear it. I just wanted it to be the FM input into Oscillator A. But a dead quick explanation on this. Again, I just found a waveform that I like. If I turn off sync at the moment, as you can see, again, it's another sort of simpler waveform. There's not a massive amount of harmonics. And this is something I do recommend. When it comes to FMing into something, you want a waveform that isn't full of a huge amount of harmonics, because then the FM just becomes unusable instantly. Like for example, let's just find a random. So that's BS2 acid. I've just got to remember that before we disappear out of it. So let's find something that's got an extreme amount of top end to it. Or a lot of harmonics. Like, let's try this. Let's see what it sounds like. And you see it's starting to sound a little bit unusable because there's obviously a lot of stuff going on in this waveform. So that's why I tend to sort of stick with something that's a little bit simpler. So if we listen back to this FM now triggered, that's a little bit better to work with, and that allows me to then add extra elements, like what we're using here is sync window half. Now one thing I do recommend is you don't just have to use this specific setting. Go through each one of these and start just panning this dial to see what kind of sounds that can be usable within this. That's always a good thing to do as well. Just going through and testing each one of these individually. Now, one thing I do recommend is don't like add a load of things all at once. Try each one individually. So, for example, instead of using FM from B, what you could do with Oscillator A by itself is just go through each one of these and test to see what happens to the sound as you're using it. And then you'll be able to think of like future sounds that you can make where it's like, okay, if I apply an LFO to this, then, oh, that might work as well. So again, with this, back to Oscillator B, this is in octave 0. So what I find with FM, if you have the FM input an octave higher than the fundamental, it allows just for that extra tonality. And we can bring this up another octave as well. So if you want to get, for example, into really screamy jump up sound, having that octave quite high is a useful thing to do. Again, I've kept the Unison at 2 just for some more sort of pitch change between the left and the right. Actually, I might turn the detune down a little bit more. Now, as you can hear with the sync half window, what it does is basically it's almost doubling the effect and adding more and more harmonics as we go through. So, like if you see this waveform, if we go to here, we've now got 2 of the waveforms, and then 3, 4, and so on. So obviously that's going to increase the pitch more and more as we go. But as you can see, I've got a modulation applied to all of these that isn't activated just yet, but you will then start to hear the sound as we start to introduce it. Which I think I will start to show these now instead of getting into the filter just yet, because this is where the sound can really start to change. And I do find filters are the crux of what Neurofunk Reese's sound like. That's where a lot of their sound comes from. But we'll look at these wavetables first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unbypass a warp. Let's listen to what that sounds like. So this is obviously set to the FM from B, and it's modulating that very slightly. So LFO1 here, I've got this set to 2 bars and in trigger mode. So because I'm going to be playing quite long notes and a couple of short ones, if I just show you the bass notes themselves, I didn't want it to just be the same repeating pattern all the way through. So that's why I've just introduced a few different notes here. And if you find that your Neurofunk basses are getting a little bit stale, doing this kind of thing can be helpful because it changes the rhythm slightly, which is quite cool. Now when it comes to the actual shape itself, in a sense, don't be too concerned with what I've drawn here, but the main thing to be aware of is that you keep it sort of a bar and above, and you have a lot of different points in it. And what I've done with this, I've matched it to the actual rhythm of the beat that I'm using in this tune. Or this example that we're showing anyway. And again, it's to taste. So obviously all of these curves, you don't have to do the same thing. But as long as you've got, not a lot, but enough changes where it's going to modulate and you can hear some differences as it goes through. Because obviously if I turn this all the way to smooth, actually that didn't change that. That's interesting. But if I was to turn this off again, like if we just go back to bypass, if you don't have that many changes or any changes at all, it's just going to sound the same throughout. So let's turn that back on. The next thing we're going to turn on is the wavetable position of A, so we're modulating that as well. Now we're starting to hear a lot of those modulation changes happen. And that is all dependent on this LFO. Now I do have a secondary LFO attached, but that's going to be applied to an EQ, but we'll get to that later on. Now the next thing we're going to apply is the wavetable's position of B, and obviously that's now going to really affect this sound here. Although it's a lot more subtle, but the more that you do to this, the more it's going to affect the FM input. And then we're just going to apply or turn on the warp of this as well. Now this probably will change the sound quite a lot, because obviously you can see that we're getting rid of harmonics when we turn it down, and that's how we've got this moving. There we go. And again, what you're doing with these is you're finding something, you're not just going to apply it and like stick it full range, because you might find that's not the sound that you want. It's a lot of this is just trial and error and to taste. So this is why a lot of people seem overwhelmed when they make or try and start to make Neurofunk basses. Is it's like there's just so much going on in the sounds, like where do I even begin? And this is a lot of trial and error. Like one bass, to set this tutorial for example, this bass took me half an hour to make, just testing simple little things. Now obviously to some people that might seem really fast, but that's because I've been practicing this for quite a few years now. So your first time getting into it, it might take you an entire day just to make one bass. But don't lose heart, just keep practicing and you will eventually get there with it. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to look at, excuse my Discord notifications there. Also I have a Discord server and you can join that, the links will be in the description. We have a lot of producers in that community, and we have a lot of fun chatting stuff about music, and obviously on stream getting together and challenging each other musically as well. So the next thing that we're getting into is the filter here as well. So one thing that I seem to find works quite well is not just a simple low pass or a simple high pass. Something that has 2 points in it, like a peak notch or a band notch, or 2 peaks or 2 notches, that kind of thing. And in this case, I decided to stick with the peak notch, 12 decibels per octave. And this is going to affect the sound quite a lot, let's just put it that way. And I've applied this to every single oscillator and output. So oscillator A, B, the noise, and the sub-oscillator. Now, the cutoff and the frequency, which is the frequency is of the notch and the cutoff is of the peak. These are the 2 things that we're modulating. Now, I've put the resonance of the peak quite high because obviously we wanted this to come through, because if I just pan this up and then you can see it doesn't really do anything. So that's why you need to have the resonance quite high as well. And I've found that having this in the really low range, so if we just turn, There we go. If we just turn that on. And if we turn that off again, you can see where a lot of this accentuation is really going to boost the sound and start to give it its tonality. The next thing is the frequency. So obviously this is the notch. Now I tend to find with the peak you want to be going up in frequencies as it's sweeping, and then the notch you want to be going down. So they're almost working against each other, and that's where you can get that sort of real interesting movement. And again, you can decide to taste how far these are going to go, and then this is again a lot of trial and error. You're just going to be keep changing values until you get to the point that you really like the sound that you've got. Now, a little bit of drive, obviously, just for some distortion, because that seems to be what I've found a lot with Neurofunk basses, is it's filtering, drive, distortion, filtering, drive, and it's just always that continuous process. Obviously, with the Serum, you are limited to only really 3 filters if we include the EQ as a filter, which it is. It's just obviously got 2 different types of filters attached to it. So obviously within Serum you're limited. If you're using something like Phase Plant, then you can just keep adding and adding and adding, and obviously going further that way. And if you wanted to do it the post-processing way, you could just get a lot of external filters and then modulate them all by hand. But obviously that will take the longest time to do, because you're having to use automation to do it. Unless you use something like a wave shaper where you get them all connected to the same thing. So that's pretty much it for this first page. With this LFO2 here, I'll just show you it dead quickly before we get into the effects. This is just set to 4 bars, and this is in off mode, so it will just always run. It's not triggered or enveloped by anything. It will just always run. But we do have that applied to the EQ, but I'll get to that when we need to. So yeah, the first thing that I apply really after all of that, which if we just quickly listen back to it, is the distortion. Now, again, this is to taste. Different types of distortion will produce a different sound, but with this one, I do like tube and soft clip the most because they round the sound out more rather than just fully breaking it and distorting it to death. Now, that might be what the sound is that you want, but in this case, I just wanted something to embellish the sound more and just brought things together. What I've done is I've applied EQ in post setting and also set the LFO to the mix as well. So these 2 things are being modulated. Now, if I just turn on the distortion frequency, with the drive turned all the way up and that turned down, you can see we just got rid of all of the top end, but that allows us to then bring things back in when we want to. Obviously, if we set it to high pass, then that brings all of the high end information back. But if you think in a sense, if you take things away to then add back in with other sounds, that's where you can really start pushing the sound further. Because obviously if you keep all of that high-end information in, there's nowhere really you can go because it's already too bright as it is. So taking stuff away, then reintroducing, taking it back. So it's almost like if you were like trimming someone's hair. I know this is a weird analogy. Like you're constantly cutting back to then sort of shape it to something else and then cut back what you've done, instead of just being left with all of the information and then not being able to do anything with it, because you can't really add to something that's 100%. So yeah, the next thing, obviously, we're modulating that mix as well. So let's listen to that, because I did find a little bit in that, back to that analogy, I wanted to introduce a little bit more of the high frequencies back in. And that's what sweeping this mix dial down does, is it just allows the original signal without the drive from the distortion to come back into the sound. And again, a lot of this is just trial and error, going through, finding the sweet spot. And what you find, obviously, because I've got quite a high resonance there, is each sound will have its sweet spot. So it's not like specific, okay, set every single Neurofunk bass you're going to do to 118 hertz, because it might not work for the specific sound you were working in or the key of the track that you're working in. For example, this one is set in F, but if I was, say, writing a track in A, that specific frequency might not work. So again, it's a lot of fine-tuning all the way through. The next thing I added was hyperdimension, and this is just to sort of, well, I'm not using the hyper part at all, I'm just using the dimension, and this is just to add a little bit of space to the mix. Imagine this like a short reverb that's in stereo, and again, this is just sort of to taste. I've brought the size down very, very low, and then the mix just above 50%. Now, again, this is a very subtle effect, so you won't really hear it that much, but it just adds some more stereo information into the sound. Next thing we've got is a filter, which again we've used another peak notch 12, and a sort of similar tactic, but instead of having this the cutoff here sweeping up and the frequency going down, I've actually done these the opposite way around, and this can be a cool effect as well. So again, you want them working against each other, but having different filters doing different things, that can just add to the sound. So if we just turn this one on, again you can hear that shape the sound even further, and this one as well. Now we're really starting to get into that territory. What you want is sort of like that pulsating sound. And again, this is a lot of trial and error. You're just going to have to keep working at fine-tuning all of these values until you find something that's useful for you to use. But I do find with peaks, sweeping really into the low end is a good idea. And your notches, mainly working between your low and your mids, is a good place to work. Once you get into your high end, it's not really going to do much to the sound unless you need to catch something that's really, really resonating. Then that can be useful to do. And again, keeping the resonance quite high for the peak, because otherwise this will not sound like anything. If I turn that off, now it starts to sound like something. Obviously don't bring the resonance too high, because then it'll just start to whistle, depending on how high you take the frequency. Next thing I've added is this chorus, and this again is just for some more stereo width. So the only issue with this skin that I've got is it says mix and level. Level is actually high pass, so if you're using the default Serum skin, that will say high pass instead. And what I do is I don't like to have any chorus in the low end, because stereo information like that can cause phasing issues, which when we get into post-processing you'll see all of the stereo work that I've done to sort of just shape the sound a little bit further. And again, this is just to add some more stereo width. It's not to be able to hear it as a chorus, so that's why I brought the feedback down, the delays down as well, so you can't really hear it that much. It's just, again, a very subtle bit of substance to the sound, just more stereo information. You could work without hyperdimension and chorus and you'd still get a good sound, but I just like to have that. It just adds a little bit of extra tonality. Next thing is the compressor, and this is our favorite thing. It just obviously sounds like the standard OTT that we're all familiar with. It's in multi-band mode. I haven't messed with the bands at all, and that's why I've set this master to 49%. So when I bring this gain up, it's where it really brings the sound back and gives it some more life. Because obviously without that, it just sounds a little bit lifeless. Even though there's a lot of movement, this really just adds some substance back to the sound. Now obviously it's going to reintroduce a lot of high-end information, which is then why we get back into the EQ. So again, imagine like I'm using this sort of like the peak notch, but I've got a notch and a low pass filter. So that's how I'm using this. The notch is sweeping down, and obviously it's going down first and then up, and then the low pass is going up and then down. So again, having opposite movements. So if I turn on this, and then if we turn on this as well, and again, this is another trial error, setting these things to taste, finding out what sounds good, what sounds bad, and where you want to take the sound. And obviously this is where this other filter comes in, because over the 4 bars this will sweep up and then back down. Again, that just adds a little bit of extra movement to the sound, which is useful. So instead of it just being at 1, now I could turn this off if I don't like the sort of brightness that's introduced, but again, if you just want a little bit more movement in the sound over time, because this one's set to 2 bars whereas this one's set to 4 bars, so again, those differences in LFOs are going to really introduce a lot more modulation and sound difference. The next thing we've got is a reverb, and I do have the this LFO applied to the mix, because I found just having the reverb on all of the time was too much. So this reverb is just going to add some a little bit of extra depth to the sound. And I've just got it in plate mode. I always find it's useful to turn the pre-delay off and the low cut up, and obviously setting the width to 100% when you've got this reverb in plate mode. And this mix is just running with the LFO, so it's acting with the rest of the modulation. Again, like the chorus and the hyperdimension, it's just a very subtle sound. So that's pretty much it for the inbuilt Serum sound. Now I'm going to play this back before we get into the post-processing. Now there is a sidechain on, so if you hear some pulsating in level, it's just because of the sidechain input. But just to show you some of the kind of notations that you can do. So I've obviously got these short notes here and then longer notes. And I've done a little bit of pitch modulation as well. So this one goes up and then the second one goes down, just for some interesting sound. I'll just solo this so we don't hear the drums just yet. Now, the one thing I do find with Neurofunk basses is by themselves, they often don't have any rhyme or reason. This is why we need a beat behind it. So if I introduce that beat and we'll listen to this, that's where it starts to make more sense what's going on rhythmically. And that's obviously when I was listening to my LFO, that's how I set it up to this rhythm that I've created. So there we go. So now the next thing, a lot of people are like, oh, so how do we just make the sound of Serum? Serum can only go so far, and all of these things that you hear from the likes of Noisia or Mefuse or any of these other Neurofunk artists, it's all about post-processing. You can get so far with Serum or Faceplant or Vital or any of these synths, but to really start to shape the sound into what you want it to be and make it your own, this is where the post-processing comes in, because you can just get that little bit extra out of the sound. So I've got a big massive effects chain here, which we're going to go into in detail. But the first thing I've got is an amp. I've set the dry wet down very, very low, and I'm using the clean sound of it. And I've set the output to dual. Now, obviously, in a different piece of software, DAW like FL Studio, Cubase, or Logic, you're going to have different sounds. What I've tried to do is keep everything stock in Ableton Live, so it's not like you have to go and buy a million different things to get this one sound. But having any type of amp, get the dry wet quite low, because you don't want this to be fully amplified, because you start to get into that really gritty sound depending on what the amp sound is supposed to be. So having this low, this just adds an extra bit of subtle distortion and saturation to the sound, just to thicken it up a little bit more. Again, that's why I've added another saturator as well. So I always turn, with Ableton Live, I turn the soft clip on just so it stops it from clipping or getting too aggressively loud and then having to work with a lot of limiters to bring it back down. And it also allows all of the effects after that to breathe a little bit more. So with this saturator, I've just kept the drive at 8 decibels, nothing too extreme, in analog clip mode, and brought the dry wet down to about 50%. And again, these are all just a shape to test. It's just more to bring a little bit of extra grit and roundness to the harmonics, some more saturation to the sound, to excuse using the same word to describe what we're making. And you can hear it's just lifting the sound a little bit more. Next step is obviously one of people's favorites to use is OTT. Now, something to bear in mind with this time function is very, very useful, and I've only recently started to use it, but it stops things sounding as aggressive. Obviously, we're bringing the amount down as well, but just increasing the time. It's just a really useful sound to have. Obviously, this is getting very bright now, but we're going to use some shaping with some EQ to bring those highs down a little bit. Next thing that we have is a glue compressor. Now, I tend to use glue compressor a lot, and I'll often use like 3 or 4 on one specific channel sound that I'm making, because the soft clip function, I often don't really use it to compress as much as this will be compressing. It's mainly just to stop things from clipping, and I just love the sound of this glue compressor. It can really make things punchy and have a nice clean saturation to it as well. Obviously, as you can see, this one is compressing a lot because of how much processing that we're doing before it, and sort of level increase as well. Next thing is an EQ8. Now, as you can see, I'm just using this in a subtractive manner, and this is just to get rid of any extreme peaks. Now, as you can hear, there's a lot going on in this top end, and that's why I've introduced this EQ. So if I play this back, I'm using this to catch those peaks that are just a little bit too strong. And I do find this area can be quite useful to notch in, because this area is the muddy area, or what can increase the muddiness of a Reese bass or a Neurofunk sound anyway. So having a notch there is useful, because then we can obviously get into extra effects if we want to apply some more saturators and compressors. Because we'll just be boosting more and more of this area if we don't obviously capture it with a notch filter. Again, I've added another saturator, a little bit less this time. Again, these settings are to taste. You can go through all of the different sounds. So I don't want to go through like, okay, use analog clip and with this specific setting, so on and so forth, because again, it's trial and error, all this. It's just, I just want to show you some fundamentals for how to get into this kind of sound design. Another glue compressor, because obviously we've added a saturator just to capture any highs that might happen, let it too loud. Now we have another EQ8 here, but this is really just to control the stereo image in the low end, because obviously now that sub has become stereo and it will phase cancel. So obviously I'm just getting rid of all of the side information, so it's now in mono, and then boosting the mids in the stereo a little bit more, just so it gives it a little bit more roundness in the stereo image. Now you can hear it's getting quite bright in certain areas. This is why we have this secondary EQ, or third EQ if we include the mid side. And again, we're just using this in a subtractive manner. There's no boosting happening. That's where we use the filters with the peak notch to obviously boost those areas and have them modulate with an LFO. Now again, I might actually, because I'm noticing that happen, is we're just going to notch this because it's getting quite extreme up here. There it is. So yeah, that sound was just getting a little bit too bright. Obviously when we bring the drums in, that won't be as noticeable, but you just want to be careful with high end because you don't want to damage people's hearing. And plus it can sound really tacky if you have too much high end in these basses, and it'll conflict with other instruments like lead sounds, vocals, or hi-hats, percussive stuff that are in your drums as well. After that, to finish off, we've got another glue compressor just to add a little bit more loudness with the makeup gain, and the threshold down slightly just to level things out level wise. So that's pretty much the majority of the sound, or all of the sound really. That's all at post-processing. So obviously we went through Serum, we had a look at all of the different settings here, and then obviously different types of post-processing that you can apply to this. Now these aren't hard and fast rules like this is all you should use. You might want to use things in different orders, and that will obviously cause a different sound as well. But just to get you, for people that are sort of new to Neurofunk basses and like, I don't know where to start, hopefully this tutorial takes you through all of those different elements of where you can actually start making a sound with, and hopefully going further with it and learning how to create your own Neurofunk basses. So let's have a listen to Back to the Sound with the Serum preset and all of the post-processing attached. So there you have it, guys. That is the fundamentals, or my way of looking at the fundamentals of how to make a Neurofunk bass. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you have, drop a like and leave a comment what you found useful in this, or other things, techniques that you might use to make Neurofunk bass as well, because obviously sharing, learning together allows us all to improve our knowledge on how to make this kind of stuff. If you've got any ideas for future tutorials, obviously leave a comment as well. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys, and until next time, goodbye.
Everybody jump up, come on!